Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. This breakout session is titled Community-Based Alternatives to Policing. If you have any questions for our presenters, please use the Q&A function on Zoom. Also, if you have any technical difficulties, please email info@mnjrc.org or text 612-361-3951. I'll also throw that in the chat. I'd like now to turn it over to our presenters for today.
Thanks so much, Lalinda. I will start us out and then I'll kind of popcorn around. I'm Marcy Ekstead. I am a research associate at the Urban League Twin Cities, and I actually also
I
also contract with the Minnesota Justice Research Center as well, as a research assistant. And I will pass it on to Dr. Akbar, and we will kind of get started around.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Alvin Akbar. I am the director of the Center for Social Justice Research, Policy, and Advocacy here at Urban League Twin Cities. Marcy is my amazing colleague and counterpart in the center.
Hey.
And we're so excited to talk to you today about just understanding ways to be in community with folks beyond just relying on police. And I will popcorn off to Dr. Raj.
I'm here. I'm excited, y'all. Thank you for being here. Ask away, especially when Marcy talks, y'all ask all kinds of questions. Pass it on to the one and only. Go ahead. The Canopy Roots.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Marissa Stevenson, she, her pronouns. I'm the program manager at Canopy Roots. We run and operate the City of Minneapolis Behavioral Crisis Response Team.
Excellent. So just to give a quick framing so that we all know kind of what we're expecting for this panel, we're going to start out with Canopy Roots, talking about the program that has been developing across the last couple now over a year, so several months, and hopefully into the future. And then we'll, from the CSJ, we'll be talking about what other cities have been doing in terms of some community-based alternatives to policing, and looking at some timelines and what those different approaches have looked like elsewhere, as well as kind of talking about some additional approaches that community has already been doing here in the cities. And then we'll kind of wrap up with a broader global conversation about the ways that we really need to care for one another as a community and what it means to really inject restorative practice across our care for one another as community, and not just relying on not relying on just police alone, but also not just relying on a concept of like one program or this idea that we can kind of just do one thing, but ultimately that it is a woven process that we need to approach this as. So I will hand it off, and I will be monitoring the Q&A throughout, but we are saving that kind of towards the end, unless something more immediate pops up, and then I will present that question, but I'll be keeping an eye on in the meantime. And I'll hand it off to Marissa, and I will share my screen here.
Great. Perfect. All right, so we can jump right in. So Canopy Roots, as I said, we are the community organization that runs the Behavioral Crisis Response Team with the City of Minneapolis. We're unarmed behavioral health first responders. Next slide, please. Our structure, so we're composed of sister organizations. Canopy Mental Health and Consulting was established first. It is a provider of outpatient and online mental health services. Historically, we serve the underserved and marginalized populations in the Twin Cities. And then Canopy Roots came about, and we're the unarmed mobile behavioral crisis response services. We're supporting the Minneapolis community via 911 dispatch, currently operating in Minneapolis proper. So our program, so the behavioral crisis response We really are, our purpose is to provide person-centered, culturally responsive crisis services to the community. We serve the lifespan, and our goal is to really decriminalize mental health, connect community members to appropriate levels of care and services, and then provide an alternative response to law enforcement for emergent 911 calls that are mental health related. So for our program, we are culturally responsive, we're unarmed, we're trained and licensed per Minnesota state statute. All of our responders are either mental health practitioners or mental health professionals. We're integrated into the 911 dispatch system. So you can think of us as the sort of, when it comes to emergency response for humans, there's MPD, fire, EMS, and now BCR. There's also animal control that is dispatched to 911 too. Right now we are running 24/7, 365, and we're independent first responders, and our services are free and voluntary. So our team consists of people with diverse backgrounds and skills. That's one of Canopy Roots' values. We try to pull people in with lived experience, who are mental health professionals, practitioners, or peer support specialists, you know, to kind of create this shared culture, languages, identities of the community, where, you know, when we're responding to calls, there's a diverse team that is available to respond. And then, you know, direct personal connections to the Minneapolis community is another thing we look for when we recruit folks. So these are the vehicles that we use to respond. Some of the key features, there's wheelchair accessibility, we have car seats, there's space for assessment. We waited a long time for these, and they have finally arrived, and we're very excited about that. Right now, there's 3 vans per shift that function. So our model is to, you know, we provide culturally responsive care by really utilizing practices of cultural responsiveness and practicing cultural humility, actively resisting the centering of white or Eurocentric culture, or American culture as the default. We also engage our team in difficult but necessary conversations. That is a way of saying, like, we talk about race on our team and race dynamics. And then we also consider community, historical, and political context in our approach to services as well. So the stance of a BCR responder stance is sort of meaning the attitude of the responder in the field. We want to be attentive to safety, self-observing, how are we showing up, empowering to the recipient, showing up as equals. They are their expert in their own life, and then also as guides. We are looking beyond appearances, and we're also trauma-informed.
And Marissa, do you mind if I ask, could you, when you say looking beyond appearances, do you mind touching on that a little bit more?
Sure. So, you know, I think we kind of come from a humanity lens where every individual deserves the highest standard of care. You know, whether, and I would say, you know, it's just the breadth of calls that we get really is for everyone, right? So what it is to sort of destigmatize mental health insofar as saying, you know, it affects every single community that there is, right? So looking beyond appearances is sort of a way of saying showing up and providing care, the same level and a high level of care to everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Our safety protocols. So part of the voluntary nature of the program is by design. So it impacts power and control dynamics, right? So because it's voluntary, if we get to a scene and somebody basically says, I don't want any services, we say, okay, right? And we leave. Outside of two situations that present themselves. So if somebody is presenting with suicidal ideation or homicidal ideation, those would be instances where it would become not necessarily voluntary. We might talk about doing a transport hold if somebody is in danger to themselves or others. We're also trained in CPI, crisis prevention, intervention, nonviolent intervention techniques to de-escalate, and the Safer R model for mental health crisis intervention. I would say the CPI, we don't use it much. We don't go hands-on with folks. So some of these embedded intervention techniques that might lend itself to touching a recipient, we really have not used for the most part. So we always respond in teams of 2. We have a lead and a supervisor support available 24/7. A lead responder would be somebody who is a responder, but they may have more clinical expertise and are on the shift. They're on the shift from 4 to 2:30 in the morning. So they're another layer of consult. And then we always have an overnight supervisor available too. So the integration into 911, so sort of to conceptualize the program a little bit, we have radios with us at all times. We're always connected to dispatch, which allows for transparency in our location, situational awareness. There's an emergency button if we ever need to hit the button that triggers a call to dispatch saying they need help, we need officers there right away. And then we also have the CAD system, or the computer assisted dispatch, in a computer tough book where we are following along. That's where we get the information. Dispatch is inputting information about the call. And then we also can utilize backup from other responders such as police, EMS, fire, animal control, by calling on our radios and asking for backup that way. All right, so our intervention. So we are trauma-informed emotional support people that, kind of go to the crisis. We offer the emotional support. We do crisis de-escalation, both emotionally and then also addressing practical needs. We'll carry snacks, water in the wintertime, and flip-flops. In the wintertime, we carry, sweatpants, blankets, hand warmers, feet warmers, things of that nature. We provide psychoeducation for the recipient and their support systems. We do risk assessments and safety planning. So, and we're also going to be connecting folks to services, whether that be shelter, hospital, maybe it's a natural support person that we can get a hold of and say, hey, are you willing to have this person come over? So we do voluntary transport as well as warm handoff. So if we're going to the hospital, say for instance, we would pull up into the ambulance bay and enter that way. And then we also do resource connections. Sometimes if we get to somebody's house and they have a support network already set up, we might say, hey, let's call your case manager right now. Or let's try to get your therapist on the phone or leave a message with them, something like that. Or if it's an elder in the community, we might say, hey, let's call the senior link line. We can do it together right now. And then also skills training to cope with current stressors, any symptoms that the recipient might be experiencing. And then additional brief interventions as needed. How am I doing on time?
You're good. Yeah.
I'm good. Okay. Challenges. So there were some challenges. I mean, we're a new entity in a very old system, and there was some general misunderstanding, public misunderstanding about kind of what we were, who we were, what we were doing. There was some initial sort of warming to do with other first responder entities, MPD specifically. At first we're kind of wary, I would say, but 2 years in now, they're one of our biggest advocates, and we work alongside them quite seamlessly most of the time. There's some misconceptions about safety. I think historically there's like a misunderstanding that crisis work is inherently dangerous, which isn't true. And then there was also some confusion about with other behavioral health first response county crisis service models and how we were different or how we weren't different. So COPE is the Hennepin County crisis provider, and they're inherently a very different model, right? So they provide stabilization, follow-up services. We don't do any of that, right? So our calls are very acute. I would say the average call takes maybe 30 minutes. Our response time is quite quick. COPE needs usually a couple of hours to get to the scene, depending on their staffing. And COPE, we also make COPE referrals, right? So if somebody feels like they need sort of like a basket underneath them, we have an internal system where we can take people's information, push it through to COPE, which has worked out really well. And I would say we are allies with COPE and vice versa. So our impact. So since launching in December of 21, we have essentially expanded the public safety ecosystem by becoming the city's newest first response team. We've diverted over 12,000 calls from police via 911 with 0 injuries to recipients. And then, we've also committed to hiring a diverse workforce of mental health practitioners, with majority identifying as people of color, Black, Indigenous, and then women and gender nonconforming. So sort of broad view, some of the policy goals that we think about is uplifting the mental health first responder career, really by establishing a statewide qualification. So police officers, firefighters, EMT have a set, kind of qualification which they would be able to apply for such job. So we want to eventually create that and have the language in legislation and in a statewide sort of way to say this is a first responder mental health job. So, and then also shrinking the police footprint for mental health 911 calls, and really the adoption and implementation of BCR-like teams statewide. This model works, and I think that every community would benefit from it. Building career paths for Black, Indigenous, people of color, students and professionals by partnering with technical colleges and universities, allocating funds to maintain a public good model for service delivery. We don't want to have to start, talking about insurance reimbursement. I think that's part of the, that's part of the model, right? Is that, when the police show up to your house, you don't get a bill in the mail for it, right? We don't want that either. So we want to stay outside of the traditional medical system and, avoid having to talk about insurance with folks. And then lastly, expanding mental health care continuum, like clinics, shelters, and beds that serve people in crisis at night and on weekends. One of the challenges for our overnight staff, and then part of our mid shift, is that, after a certain point in the day, shelters are almost like non-existent for openings. And so it becomes, sort of a challenge to figure out how we can best serve that person in the moment. So that is all I have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Marissa. And I do have at least one question in the chat that I feel like is really useful to maybe speak to right now, especially kind of with the previous slide about challenges that you've made, that Canopy Roots has maybe faced. So the question is, what has the relationship with the city of Minneapolis been like? I read some concerns about lack of support in the past, that is not following through with commitments. And they were also wondering whether or not they're a main funder.
Yeah, good question. So yes, they are the main funder for this program. We do have an allocated stream of funding that was established. So we're good for that right now. What has the relationship been like? I think it's been evolving, right? I think that, like I said, sort of earlier, and I just systemically, historically, when you're coming into a system that has already been established with sort of the status quo, and you have, leaders that, vary in sort of where their politics lie, there's going to be some challenges. I think that's a natural part of sort of trailblazing and breaking into systems. So I would say it's evolving. It's mixed. Yeah, I'll pause there.
Yeah, no, that's useful. And then there's one other question that I felt like would be good. And then I see the other questions too, but I'll save those to the end. But one of the questions was, because calls are routed through 911, how often do police end up on site with you?
Sure. Yeah. I would say the majority of the calls that we take, we respond on our own. If I had to give a percentage, it would, I don't know if I want to do that because it's a little choppy, but I would say, 7 times out of 10, we respond on our own. We don't call for backup, and then the other times we do. And then also if, and just to clarify, so if we call for EMS, often 98% of the time a squad is assigned as well. So even if they don't really interact with the recipient, they're there just to make sure things are, I think mostly for EMS, they prefer to have a squad on scene.
Yeah, thank you. So now I'm going to actually transition it to our conversation about what some other initiatives have looked like, some which are more kind of like a mental health alternative type team. So we're going to talk about a couple of those. And then also there is, I think, an important piece around the idea of like completely deconstructing and then recreating a police force, like what has happened in New Jersey and Camden. So we're going to kind of cover some of those details here. So just to start, I will hand it over to Dr. Akbar to speak about Oregon.
Thank you, Marcy. Yes, hi all. So, in speaking, I think this is the kind of great jumping off point, following up with Marissa's discussion of Canopy Roots work, because I think for folks who are newer to understanding what's actually going on with this kind of harm, like this kind of emergency response that doesn't utilize an armed response presence as often, it can feel like, well, Is this something that's actually sustainable in the long term? Is this something that would really work for our city? Is this something that we could even really keep running on a long-term basis? And so we want to point to models like the Cahoots model, which I believe informs some of Canopy Root's conception here. But Cahoots, so crisis assistance helping out on the streets, is based out of Eugene, Oregon. So if y'all are familiar with the University of Oregon, Eugene is kind of the college town that encompasses that and then more, and is one of the second largest metro in the state of Oregon. So Cahoots has been around for quite a bit. It's a little bit older than I am. So initially formulated with EP, or rather, initially funded with police department funds in 1989. So this was really kind of getting things off the ground early and thinking back to what that timeline looked like, right? There's been a lot going on with the need for crisis responding for as long as we've had the idea that we should be able to call someone and get help. Right. So understanding what this has looked like, Cahoots has been funded predominantly supported by the White Bear Clinic in Eugene. So they are kind of a behavioral health care and health crisis team. But a lot of this has still meant that they are working with the resources they have as a medical entity. So being able to expand their services to 24/7 delivery did not really happen until the last decade, when they were given additional pushes of funding to increase that service. And then shifting away from the police department towards the fire department, again, in some of a post-uprising and just organizational restructuring kind of idea. It's really looking at unarmed responses as the gold standard or the goalpost, rather than as the kind of exception to the rule, right? Looking at the fact that there's lots of crises going on that require assistance that don't necessarily require someone to show up armed and ready to deal with, potential combat or physical conflict in the same way. So Cahoots has diverted about 3 to 8% of police calls in their tenure there, increasing as their budgets have increased as well, but also paying for themselves with savings savings to the city. So again, point to the fact that while the on-ramp to get these things going might be a little bit daunting, this is a public good, right? Moving towards the idea that this is not just something that we're doing to be, be extra, be additional, to try to, do more than we can with what we have, but rather investing in a new type of response to fit a need that has already existed. So of the 24,000 calls in 2019, only about 300 of them required police backup. So again, behavioral crisis response, mental health crisis, or in the case of Cahoots, right, they focus on folks who are dealing with chronic homelessness and addiction, and folks who are dealing with mental illness. So this is not necessarily those who are already becoming violent, if they are met with the right kind of response, with the right kind of humanity, and understanding of what certain things look like, right? Understanding that mental illness or addiction may not necessarily, it may look a little bit daunting, a little bit confusing, or sometimes even threatening. Someone's shouting at you. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to escalate to violence unless someone else takes things there or responds in a way that really rattles them. So having crisis responders, so I believe they also respond in teams of 2. Typically, they have a crisis responder as well as basically a mental health or behavioral health support. So working with these teams to both address the immediate point of crisis as well as getting them resourced. But one of the biggest issues with Cahoots is that, again, they only operate within the city limits of Eugene, which if you know the area, Eugene is kind of the largest city in a very rural suburban area of Oregon. So going out beyond city limits is something that they don't have capacity for. And even within the city limits of Eugene, their response times can be pretty rough. That 2-hour response time, especially given, again, their scope of services, right? They do cover issues of addiction. They do, in addition to mental illness and chronic homelessness. So they're working with getting folks resourced on top of the immediate crisis response, and staffing for those kinds of quick response times takes further investment than I think a lot of folks are able to scale up appropriately. So that's been one of their not even growing pains, but maintenance subsistence pains as well. So yeah, that's just kind of pointing to the fact that this kind of thing, the work that's being spearheaded by Canopy Roots here in Minneapolis, is something that can be sustained long term, and that as you scale up, while it will not be without challenge, it definitely does pay in results. There are more people still alive today able to speak to their experience or having been having been properly helped by these kinds of works than if we were remaining, and stress on resources and city infrastructure is reduced by this kind of work. I'll hand off to Marcy to talk a little bit more about what this looks like from the police side of things.
Great, thank you. And I did, somebody asked about where funding usually comes from, and a lot of these programs, it kind of depends, but typically, like with Cahoots, that's a city budget item, and it's also because it was situated with, adjacent to like the city's police, and now transitioned over to the fire department. So it's like wrapped up with those entities.
I think they've been scaling to both the city budget as well as some of the extant counties, as they've been shifting their ethos a little bit more towards their community-oriented rooting. So the counties have been starting to do more investment in this work, but again, scaling up, getting folks on board is one of the major issues. I think Marissa touched on a lot of these same kinds of misconceptions, misinformations, or even just pushback and resistance from folks who aren't necessarily ready to give over those reins for what they feel is a criminal issue.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for adding that. So I wanted to touch on, obviously this is not necessarily, interestingly, Camden has been framing their approach to policing as kind of very community-based. So but it's interesting because it's another police department. So it's not necessarily an alternative, but I think it's still important to touch on this because people have been talking about this ever since it happened, and really highlighting it as kind of this gold standard, or like something really seminal to look at. But I think it's important to also kind of look at it a little more closely in terms of the development over time, especially since it's been about 10 years since the actual origin of the shift. So in 2013, Camden, New Jersey had their police department completely disbanded, and then they've recreated essentially a police force called Camden County Police. The name is a bit of a misnomer because it just serves the city. It doesn't serve a county. But they have seen a pretty significant statistical drop in violent crime since 2013, 38%, but there is some contention regarding how they're getting those numbers and the ways that numbers are being presented. So I'm just going to be upfront about that. Feel free, in our notes on the slides, you can look at the links to read more about that. But there has also been fewer than 5 excessive force complaints per year as of 2020. That was how many that they had received. However, citations and ticketing had increased pretty substantially, and particularly for petty offenses, causing a large backup in municipal court, and then obviously having to deal with that from the community side of things. So this approach is focused on more of a guardian approach versus a lot of times we hear about the warrior approach that police tend to use or have historically used. That's a lot more almost like people are engaging in war, or war preparation, or thinking about defense of themselves, and being a kind of a fear-based, related very much to with their community. It's being afraid of whoever they're engaging with, and kind of coming from that point of view, versus the guardian is a little bit more supposed to be engaged and protective. And then for part of this, they have encouraged community to self-monitor, but there's really no mental health specific diversion programming, so they don't have a separate entity that is doing what, for example, Canopy Roots or Cahoots are doing. So some significant areas of tension do exist, I think naturally, because it's not quite addressing things in a holistic manner. So some of the things that some community members have brought up are that the force still doesn't represent the community. So Camden is a very, very racially diverse community, and the police force itself is still about 50% white. And turnover rates are relatively high from my understanding. Additionally, despite being part of a federal program that's supposed to track and improve policing, there has been a pretty notable lack of online data reporting that's available for people to see. So it's hard to say like how effective it is outside of maybe their own reports that are being put out without actual solid data. And then finally, a big critique of this has been that there's significant surveillance happening in the community with this program, and including things like broken windows type policing, where they kind of do like quality of life, arrests or, citations. So if you're like, I read one interview with a police officer saying that they would arrest somebody who's for smoking a joint on like the street, rather than maybe like, the journalist to ask like, oh, why wouldn't you just like maybe give them a warning and then, let them go on their way? And that just didn't seem like that was the option for that officer. And that seems like that's kind of a common response. But I did want to also address a newer program that is community-based alternative. So this is the Mobile Assistance Community Responders of Oakland. So Oakland, California has just started in 2022 a program, and it is connected with the police and fire. So in August of 2022, the police and fire began dispatching calls to this program, and they started it as a pilot. So it's an 18-month pilot specifically housed with a fire department. And then from January to March of this year, they took over 5,000 calls and had almost 6 daily dispatches on average for their team. So things are definitely being utilized. However, a couple more areas of tension for them are that they aren't getting a lot of calls from the actual Oakland police. So they're really mostly getting calls from community and business owners rather than from the police office. And then they're also having they have a prohibition of responders going into buildings. I think because of their association with the fire department, that's a point of contention. They're just not allowed to go in buildings, which really limits their capacity to do work. So they do a lot more on the street. And then their community advisory board, their meetings aren't public, and their minutes are also not made public or posted publicly. So that's been something that community has raised concern about, because they would like to obviously keep tabs of what's going on with the advisory board. So obviously these are just snippets and glimpses into what other cities are doing long-term, short-term, and some, that have been raised as really good models, but I think it's important for us to kind of interrogate what that looks like and whether or not like the community is really being served, and the community voice is really being uplifted through these approaches. And I think these areas of tension especially are so important for us to learn from as we continue to go through and like care for one another in our community, and as we already have been. So I want to make sure that we take time, and Dr. Akbar will talk about this, but we really wanted to highlight the fact that Minneapolis and like the Twin Cities folks have already been caring for our community, and Canopy Roots is just like another iteration of what that has looked like and continues to look like for us. So yeah, I'll hand it off.
Thank you, Marcy. Yeah, so I think we would be remiss if we're talking about a community-based or alternative to policing, if we didn't talk about some of the amazing efforts happening here within the Twin Cities and especially Minneapolis, right? So one of the things that's really been, I think become more obvious in recent years is that there is a very strong community here that is willing to, pull up our slacks and get get work done to ensure safety and prosperity for all the folks living in it. So we wanted to just spotlight a few of the organizations doing work here. This is not by any means an exhaustive list, but these are some folks who've been active in this space. So first is A Mother's Love. So they are also, a lot of their work is focused around domestic violence and gun violence. So it's representative of folks who are mothers of folks who are in justice impacted, folks who have children who are members of the LGBTQ community, folks who have been survivors of the kinds of issues that they are working to address. And so one of their big pushes has really been resourcing folks as they come, and also doing a lot of community education and work to make sure that people have folks in their corner who look like them, have additional support folks that they can call, and ways to really de-escalate some of these contentious situations, preventing things from hitting the flashpoint of conflict, right? Not necessarily just trying to break up a fight once it's happened, but actually teaching folks about just the ways that, especially gun violence can escalate things beyond the point of recovery for a lot of folks, and helping folks get skill build and de-escalate before it gets to that point. Likewise, I'd like to spotlight Mad Dads in Minneapolis, and I'm going to make sure I get their acronym correct, because it's honestly, I wish I had the ability to make acronyms that actually work like this, but so they are Men Against Destruction, Defending Against Drugs and Social Disorder. And so Mad Dads, initially rooted out of Omaha, Nebraska. Their chapter here has been doing work in the community for many, many years at this point. I think they just celebrated their 25th anniversary working with our communities. But they really focus on kind of a wraparound approach to community safety and community development. So they do also focus on some of the de-escalation work, skill building, and positive youth development, especially. So a lot of community programming, a focus on fatherhood, especially in engaging and protecting community youth and families. A lot of their work also has looked at really interrupting the pipeline into issues like drug addiction. So both helping folks to understand what these substances actually look like, what they're actually doing to your bodies, as well as what signs and supports for folks dealing with addiction can look like. So a lot of their work, again, they're really community rooted, working with things like understanding the pipeline between food and crime, right? The fact that if there's a motive and an opportunity, that's where you're going to see a lot of this crime popping up. And likewise, if folks are hungry and you can actually address that root need, that motive, you're going to see a reduction. So a lot of their work has taken kind of a whole community approach to this, getting into the community, getting into schools, doing street patrols, buses and train outreach, and helping folks get where they need to safely, and really just trying to again do more of the preventative work that leads to a lot of these crimes of need or crimes of opportunity. And I'd also like to spotlight Violence Interrupters, a Minneapolis and Touch Outreach. So intermeshed organizations, but really focusing on boots on the ground, de-escalation training and work. So working with folks who are enmeshed in some of the more violent scenes in the Twin Cities. So interfering and really getting into de-escalation and communication with folks who are in drug and gang conflict, right? And these are just regular folks who are getting on the ground. They're unarmed, but just kind of going in with some de-escalation training, a knowledge of their neighborhoods and communities, and care for the kind of work being done. And so a lot of their work has really been about making the streets safer to walk for folks. And this doesn't necessarily look like going out like an armed militia, but does look like a lot of folks setting boundary lines, communicating, knowing their neighborhoods, and enhancing that network. That I think also, as A Mother's Love kind of points to, bringing back the village, right? So a lot of the work of these organizations has been about reconnecting or strengthening connections between and across communities, to make sure that we actually have something resembling the network that as the cities get more populous, as we get a little more digitized, as we get a little more further removed from each other in person, that we still don't lose track of the fact that a lot of the best way to prevent violence or deal with violence is to prevent the sources of it. So that lack of opportunity, disenfranchisement, needs that aren't being met. But likewise, some of the challenges that have come with this kind of work is actually pretty familiar to many who are in the nonprofit landscape. So one of the violence interrupters actually recently made a lot of waves in the news cycles because despite having had some pretty substantive felt on the ground impacts on reducing instances and outbreaks of violence and increasing general perceptions of safety, they've also been asked for things like and like reporting on how the funds have been used, which kind of points to an issue in the nonprofit landscape of being asked to have like basically what amounts to overhead costs. So folks who are actually doing the accounting, budgeting, report creation, and formulation, but also not necessarily having funding devoted to that kind of thing. And then subsequently being surprised, like, wait, why don't you have this report on what you've been doing? And it's like, we've been on the streets doing the thing you paid us to do. Right. So, and there's a lot of political motive behind this as well, as we are in a city where we are both facing a crisis of, recruiting good officers to forces, but also dealing with the fact that the forces that we've been working with have had substantive and noted issues that have been recognized now on a local, national, and international scale. Right. So it really does mean there's a lot to be said for accountability, but there's also a lot to be said for opportunistic attempts to delegitimize some of this work, as well as just a need for support for that kind of transparency that we call for with our public funds.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Akbar and Dr. Raj. I am so excited. I am loving the idea of like having you wrap us all up with the global picture of like what this all means, like what it ultimately like bringing us back to the purpose of all of this and what it means to like think about how we care about each other as a community, and then we'll have our question and answers.
Yeah. I don't know. There are about 53 people on the screen, so I want to invite all of you to stand up, stretch out, right? Come on, right? I know you've been like loaded with information and you're excited and you are also asking some strong questions, right? So want to invite us to continuously focus on our breath, breathe in and breathe out. And let us also take a quick minute to recognize that we are, right, standing on the Dakota, Lakota, and Ojibwe Anishinaabe community land and space. Want to honor their original spirits and the stewards of this land. So as we breathe in and breathe out, want to take this time to, right, appreciate the many generations of Indigenous communities who are here, continuously staying in this struggle and continuously trying to teach us, right, how thousands of years of wisdom could lead us in a different path. Want to honor that, and also want to honor the presence and the wisdom of the communities that were stolen bodies from the continent of Africa. Want to appreciate them and their resistance and their fight for justice, right? And how that has carried on 400 years into this struggle, right? And the many generations of the Black community that are contributing to our betterment. So I want to appreciate that. So as we breathe in and breathe out and focus on this, right? I love hearing what Canopy Roots is doing and what Dr. Akbar and Marcy were able to share with us. These are all, in my world, we think about liberation, right? People in many civil rights leaders have often said, right, the opposite of war is not peace, it is liberation. When bodies are liberated from the tentacles of the harm that systems cause, we are able to, right, lock in with our agencies and do better for ourselves and have each other's back, as we say in the streets, right? who got your back? We got your back, right? And how do we underscore the need for our bodies and our minds and our hearts to be liberated from all of the ways that systems are set up that continuously says, here we are to rescue you, at the same time we're going to harm you, right? As sometimes we understand that systems, right, responses are informed by rituals and this heavy set of gravity, right? And gravity comes in the form of they having resources, they have rules, right? And then they simply react. A lot of our systems, right, react, and they have right, a system that enforces or expect people to comply, right? So when you have enforcement and compliance as your rules, and you are simply reacting with that amount of resources you have here, right? We have millions and millions of dollars poured into, right, an enforcement culture, right? Even yesterday, the city announced that they are going to give law enforcement millions of dollars to do recruitment. They're missing 180 police officers, so we need more police officers in the streets. We tend to always, right, lean in that direction. It's sort of like what, right, the forces we call the centripetal force in physics, right? I know y'all didn't come here this morning thinking like, I'm going to learn something about physics, but centripetal force often says, right, we rotate around the system, but are pulled into the system, right, as opposed to pulling away. What Canopy is doing is to slowly move you away from the over-reliance on systems and continuously create a trustworthy community where we can rely on each other, right? We can resolve this type of crisis in our communities when we are not faced with enforcement and compliance, right? Original ideas of 911 comes from Black leaders in Philadelphia and other places, seeing that people are dropping and are in need of care, and nobody is coming to their rescue, forming, right, what we call 911 responses on their own to respond to these community needs. And that was then taken and systematized and then weaponized, right, against Black and brown bodies, right? These are part and parcel of the history of things like 911, right? Because wisdom that came from our Black Panther informed us that people need to be fed. Let's feed them. Let's feed our children, right? Minnesota wants to hail itself. It's like, now we have, everybody has a meal. Bro, that is so old. That is like 1960s idea. You're just now realizing what can be done, right? So we keep hailing ourselves and seeing how progressive we are. So I want to jump in and say, right, what Canopy is suggesting is doing what push for peace, right? Many of these type of mother's love are all intentionally trying to walk with people. This is an old, ancient, right, belief system in many indigenous communities where they say this idea of concentric relationship. You are in relationship with the geographical nature and the topography of the land, so you can walk in relation to the land as opposed to cutting through and dissecting the land as it is presented to us, because we are not comfortable, right? So these are all like ancient wisdom. We're slowly but surely in 2023 still struggling to bring into existence, because we have done such a great job in pushing them out and making our communities overly reliant on systems, right? I'll just quickly say, right, in the Aborigine communities in Australia often say, right, to white saviors who come in there and say, I came here to help you. And they will often say, if you have come here to help me, it's too late, bro. Right? If you come here knowing that your humanity and liberation is bound in mine and mine in yours, let's get to work. That's the idea that we are trying to do, right? In the form of having, right, community responders, right? As opposed to systems responders. Do they have a place? Yes, they do have a place in our community, right? But do we have to be overly reliant and check our agencies? Hell no, right? Hell no. So let us continuously process the need on how to raise our agencies that has been locked away because systems have said we have the right response. Just call 911 and stay out of our way. No, right? Enough is enough. Right. So I wanna say that and also say that today, if you're taking away anything, right? What Canopy Roots and others are doing is to figure out how to lower the footprints of law enforcement in our communities, so that we now can expand the brilliance of the community, because now we can take those same resources that have been dumped into enforcement and compliance systems and into our communities, and now we can expand our wherewithals and be present to deal with our concerns. I love y'all. Thank you. Let's get to answer questions.
Thank you, Raj. That was beautiful. And absolutely. And that's such exactly what Kayla was naming earlier, right? At the beginning of this conference today, she was talking about how imagination is such a powerful thing. And we need to like also not just center like our own humanity, but the community, right? We need to recenter our communal humanity in order to like recognize that we do have that the dignity and worth, and we do have the power to, and we should have the agency to do these things for ourselves, and we know how to take care of community, knows how to take care of community, and we can work together to repair harm and to learn and to grow. So anyway, but I want to make sure that we get some of this Q&A in. So there are a couple questions that are specific to Canopy Roots. So Marissa, I'm going to throw a couple of those your way really quick. So one question is, does mental health crisis, and this might be applicable broadly too, but does mental health crisis include overdose responses, substance use disorders, or other issues related to drugs, or are those conceived kind of separately?
Sure. Good question. So yeah, we do see a lot of co-occurring diagnoses. So we, try to connect folks to services that are appropriate to what they need. One clarification, so overdose response, however, is going to be different. That's EMS. If there's an active overdose happening, that would not be our call.
Yeah, okay. And then another, I wanted to follow up about the 911 question. Somebody asked whether 911, if police don't come if you don't call for them, or if they, how that looks.
Yeah. So if we don't call, it's just our call, but then we can call for backup if we need it.
Great. Okay. And then, yeah, so there are a couple of good, I know we don't have a lot of time, but there was one more question about and somebody shared some resources and a shout out, so I'll send those to the chat. But one person asked what some thoughts are on Brooklyn Park's program partnering social workers with a paramedic to respond to 911 calls. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we had something similar. So I moved here from Denton, Texas a few years ago, and Denton County had also piloted something similar with like hiring an on-staff counselor for the police department for the purpose of response, but they hired one counselor for the entire county of Denton, which is about 250,000 people spread out across about several thousand square miles. So I think these kinds of programs can be helpful, but one, the level of support and level of burnout that is accompanied in these positions, I think can be kind of like really speaks to the fact that you can't just enter this lightly, and it does need to be something that you reinforce with a good workplace culture as well, as a good, adequate amounts of staffing, supports, and breaks from very intensive trauma-inducing and trauma-intensive work. So I think this kind of model might be closer to what we might need going forward. But I also am just wary of structurally, like, how is this position being set up? So I would need to learn more about what their setup looks like before I can comment on how well I think that might work. But I think it's going in the right direction, as long as it's also paired with some of the additional supports. Not to underscore the extent to which social work itself has also been, party to some of the harms that have been caused by a lot of our systems and structures. So there's not a perfect solution, which kind of also touching on one of the more honestly really fantastic but also very weighty question towards the end there, right? But I think how it's set up is going to really be community dependent, but there are some best practices around adequate supports for the folks working in those roles, the kinds of folks you're hiring for that work, and again, the amount of support they have internally and what that work culture looks like that can really make or break the success of that program, especially in its infancy.
Excellent. Well, yeah, we are all, oh, sorry, really quick,
No,
but yeah, we're
I just want to say, so there is, systems have woken up to the demands, and now they're saying, oh, we're going to have embedded social workers, but still they are still trying to control this sort of liberated processes within the system and say, see how amazing we are. We have taken your ideas and instituted and systematized. So we, from an idealistic liberationist perspective, an abolitionist perspective, I say, get the hell out of our way. Give us a resource. Get out of our way. Don't embed us. We know how to live in and work in the community versus trying to be embedded through the police department. This is not a war. This is not a battleground to be embedded with the troops, right? This idea comes from this war theater, right? Stop that bullshit, y'all, right? Let's call systems to step out of the way. Let's humanize this work.
Well, with that, thank you everyone for being on the panel, and thank you all for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but I really appreciate it. And there were some really cool, if you want to take a look, there are some really cool like shout outs about like just appreciation for these kinds of programs and for the clarification about, with misinformation out there. So thanks everybody.